The Rio Bravo had never risen that fast in living memory, and Patrick Hawkins stood at the edge of what used to be his front porch watching the brown water swallow the last good thing he had ever built with his own two hands. The year was 1882, and the land along the southern stretch of Texas near the town of Harlow's Bend had been bone dry for the better part of 3 summers running. Ranchers had moved on, homesteaders had given up their deeds and drifted west toward cheaper promises, and the few who remained had grown as tough and wind-scarred as the mesquite trees that dotted the scrubland. Patrick Hawkins was among those who had stayed, and he had stayed because leaving was something he simply did not know how to do. Not since his father had done it first, slipping away in the night when Patrick was 11 years old and never sending so much as a letter to explain why. Patrick was 31 years old and stood 6 feet and 2 inches in his worn boots, with broad shoulders that had carried fence posts and hay bales and grief in roughly equal measure. His hair was dark and thick, the color of good river mud, and his eyes were a shade of brown so deep and steady that the few people who looked into them long enough often felt they were reading something carved into old wood rather than living inside a man's face. He had a jaw that looked like it had been shaped by someone who believed in clean lines and hard work, and a scar along his left forearm where a barbed wire fence had disagreed with him during a windstorm 3 years prior. He owned 340 acres of land in Harlow's Bend, Texas. He had cattle, or he'd had cattle before the drought thinned the herd to a fraction of what it once was. He had a barn that he had raised himself, board by board, over the course of 2 summers. He had a house with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that smelled of sawdust and coffee and sometimes, when the wind came from the south, a faint sweetness he could never quite identify. He had built all of it alone because he had never learned to ask for help, and he had never learned to ask for help because he had come to believe, somewhere in the scarred country of his boyhood, that asking meant owing, and owing meant giving someone power over you, and giving someone power over you meant the kind of hurt that did not heal clean. And then September arrived, and with it came something no one had predicted. The rains came from the north and the south simultaneously, 2 weather systems colliding over the panhandle and pouring everything they had onto the parched earth of Harlow's Bend in the space of 36 hours. The ground, hardened and cracked from the drought, could not absorb what fell from the sky. The water ran off in sheets and found the Rio Bravo swollen and angry and looking for something to take. It found Patrick Hawkins's land first. He had tried to move the cattle to higher ground the night the rains began, riding through the dark on his horse, a big gray gelding named Sutter, shouting himself hoarse and pushing the animals up the long slope behind the house toward the ridge where the mesquite grew thickest. He had gotten most of them up, not all. He had lost 11 head in the night, heard them bellow once and then go quiet in the dark and the rain, and he had not gone back to look because there was nothing to be done and everything still to try to save. By morning, the water was at the floorboards of the house. By afternoon, it was at his knees inside the kitchen. He had carried what he could to the barn loft, which sat on slightly higher ground. He carried his mother's Bible, which was the only thing of hers he had. He carried 2 months' worth of canned goods and a sack of flour wrapped in oilcloth. He carried his rifle, his pistol, his father's old pocket watch that he kept though he wasn't sure why, and the deed to his land, sealed in a tin box that he had bought in town for exactly this kind of emergency, though he had not believed the emergency would ever come. He did not carry the furniture. He watched his kitchen table float, turn slowly and bump against the wall. He watched his bed frame tilt and slide. He watched 31 years of stubbornness meet the one force more stubborn than himself, and he did not ask for help because there was no one to ask. He was sitting in the barn loft, soaking wet and hollow inside, when he heard the sound of oars. He heard them before he saw the boat, a flat-bottomed skiff being rowed with economy and purpose through the gap where his corral gate used to be. Sitting in it, rowing with both oars and navigating the debris with something that looked very much like practiced confidence, was a woman. She wore a wide-brimmed hat that had gone dark with rain. Her hair was the color of wheat in late July, pulled back and pinned, but beginning to escape around her temples in damp curls. She was wearing a work dress, practical and plain, in faded blue calico, and over it a man's oilskin coat that was 3 sizes too large for her. She was perhaps 5 feet and 5 inches tall, Patrick estimated, and she looked to be around 26 or 27 with a face that was open and clear, and currently wearing an expression of calm, focused determination that he found utterly startling given the circumstances. He opened the barn loft door above her and stared. She looked up without surprise. "Patrick Hawkins," she said. Her voice carried over the water without effort, clear and direct. "That's me," he said. "I am Pearl Donnelly. I run the boarding house on the north side of Harlow's Bend. The Reverend Alcott said your place was likely the worst hit on this stretch of the river and asked if someone might check on you." She paused. No one else volunteered. He did not know what to say to that. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No," he said. "Are you alone?" "Yes." She looked at the water around her, at the house with its windows half submerged, at the debris floating past. She looked back up at him. "Well then," she said, "come down. I brought food." He climbed down, and that was the moment everything changed, though he would not understand that for some time. Pearl Donnelly had come to Harlow's Bend 2 years before Patrick's flood, arriving on the southbound stage from San Antonio with a carpet bag, a trunk of linens, and a business arrangement she had made entirely through correspondence with a widow named Edna Marsh, who owned a large house on Clement Street and wanted to sell it and move to live with her daughter in Houston. Pearl had bought the house for a fair price using money she had saved over 4 years of working in her aunt's dry goods store in Austin, and she had turned it into a boarding house within 3 months of arrival. She was 27 years old. She had grown up in Austin, the second daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died of fever when Pearl was 13. She had learned practical things early. She could cook and keep accounts and fix a leaky pipe with copper solder and a steady hand. She could read a contract and spot an unfair clause. She could manage difficult men without raising her voice, a skill she attributed directly to having grown up around her father's students. She did not consider herself remarkable, but the people of Harlow's Bend had come to find her indispensable in the quiet, reliable way that a good water pump becomes indispensable, the kind of thing you notice most sharply when it is gone. She knew who Patrick Hawkins was, as everyone in a town of 400 knows everyone else. She knew he ran cattle on the river land south of town. She knew he came into town once a week for supplies and never stayed long enough to have a conversation. She knew the blacksmith, Olin Purdy, said that Patrick Hawkins was the most capable man in 3 counties and also the most sealed off, like a jar with no lid wrench in the world big enough to open it. She knew he had never been married. She had seen him in Teague's General Store twice, and on both occasions he had nodded at her with his hat held at his side, said good morning or good afternoon depending on the hour, and gone back to examining whatever it was he'd come to buy. She had not thought of him particularly, which was honest, and she thought of very few people particularly when there was work to be done, which was always. But when Reverend Alcott had stood in the doorway of the boarding house on the morning of the 2nd day of rain and said that the river land was going under and someone ought to check on the Hawkins place, Pearl had been the one to say she would go. Partly because she had the skiff, which her boarder Mr. Calloway had left behind when he moved on 3 months ago, and which she had kept for no reason she could name. Partly because she had grown up near the Colorado River and knew flood behavior. And partly because something in the way the Reverend described the situation, a man alone out there, nothing but the barn still standing, made something in her chest tighten in a way she chose not to examine too closely. She had rode out in the rain with a basket of food, 2 dry blankets rolled in oilcloth, and the flat-bottomed sense that someone needed something, and she was the available person to provide it. What she had not expected was Patrick Hawkins sitting in a barn loft looking like a man who had just watched his life float past him and was trying very hard to look like he had not noticed. He climbed down the ladder from the loft and dropped into the water beside her skiff. It came to his thighs. He grabbed the bow of the skiff without being asked, steadied it, and helped her secure it to a post. He did all of this efficiently and without a word, and she noticed that his hands, even now, even soaking wet and clearly exhausted, were entirely steady. "I brought cornbread and salt pork," she said, passing him the basket. "And there is coffee in the jug. It is cold now, but it is still coffee." He took the basket. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Why?" he said. "Why what? Why did you come?" She considered him for a moment. He was not asking it rudely. He was asking it the way a man asks something he genuinely cannot parse, with a kind of confused sincerity that was almost painful to witness. "Because you were here and you needed help," she said. "That is generally sufficient reason." He seemed to turn this over internally like a man reading a map in a language he only partially knew. "I am fine," he said. "You are sitting in floodwater in a barn loft without dry food or a way to get to town," she said pleasantly. "You are not fine, but you will be." She pulled the second oar into the skiff and settled herself. "Eat something and then we will get you to higher ground." He ate. He ate standing in the thigh-deep water beside the skiff, because there was nowhere to sit, and he ate quickly and without ceremony, the way a man eats when he has not let himself think about hunger in the midst of crisis. She watched him sideways and did not say anything, which he would later think about more than he expected to. When he was done, they loaded the tin box with his deed, his rifle, and the Bible into the skiff, and she rowed them both out through the gap in the corral fence and across the submerged road toward Harlow's Bend. He offered to row. She said she knew the water and let her do it. He sat in the bow and watched her handle the oars and said nothing, but his jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with anger. He stayed at the boarding house on Clement Street. He had not intended to stay. He had intended to wait for the water to recede and then go back. But Reverend Alcott told him the road to the river land would be impassable for at least a week, and the few men in town who might have offered a spare room were already packed tight with displaced neighbors. So Pearl Donnelly had said with the same practical directness. She seemed to apply to everything that the boarding house had one room vacant, the one at the end of the hall, and it was his if he wanted it. He said he would pay for it. She said she knew he would. He moved in that afternoon. The boarding house was a large, well-kept structure with a wide front porch and white-painted shutters that Pearl touched up every spring. Inside it was clean and warm and smelled of beeswax and the faint ghost of 100 meals. There were 4 other boarders currently in residence. There was Mr. Henry Foss, an older gentleman who sold farm equipment up and down the territory and came through Harlow's Bend every fall. There was the Caldwell brothers, Amos and Roy, who worked at the mill and shared a room with the easy silence of men who have lived together their whole lives. And there was Miss Loretta Vance, a dressmaker of 40 who had a sharp tongue, a generous heart, and eyes that noticed everything and made no secret of it. It was Loretta Vance who noted, the very first evening at supper, that Patrick Hawkins had very fine posture for a cattle rancher and had Pearl noticed. Pearl told Loretta to eat her potatoes. Supper at the boarding house was served at 6 o'clock precisely, and Patrick came downstairs to find the table already set, and 5 people already seated and 1 empty chair between Mr. Foss and the window. He sat in it, set his hat on the empty chair arm since there was no hook within reach, and looked at the table. Pearl brought out the pot herself because the girl who helped her with kitchen work, a 16-year-old named Bess, had gone home to her family when the rains began. She set down a pot of venison stew, a plate of biscuits, and a bowl of pickled okra that she knew Henry Foss was particularly fond of, and she poured coffee without being asked and sat down at the head of the table. It was an ordinary supper. Patrick ate quietly, answered direct questions with brief honest answers, and thanked Pearl when she passed him the biscuits. But twice, when the conversation moved in directions that made the rest of the table laugh, something happened in his face. It was not quite a smile. It was the thing that lives just behind a smile, a slight softening around the eyes, a barely perceptible ease in the set of his shoulders, and Pearl noticed it both times and then looked away before he could catch her looking. After supper, the men went to the front porch and Patrick went to his room, and Pearl washed the dishes and thought about the expression on his face when she had rowed up to his barn in the flood and said she had brought food. It was the expression of a man who had been expecting something to hit him and instead had been handed something warm, and who did not know what to do with the difference. The water did not recede in a week. It receded in 2.5, and during that time Patrick Hawkins lived at Pearl Donnelly's boarding house and ate her cooking and slept in her spare room and slowly, without designing it or particularly wanting to, became woven into the daily fabric of the place. It started practically. On the third day, he noticed a loose board on the front porch steps and fixed it without being asked, using tools he found in the shed behind the house. Pearl came outside to find it done, and said thank you with a directness that somehow managed to land as more genuine than any elaborate expression of gratitude might have been. On the fourth day, he chopped 3 weeks' worth of firewood because there was a wood pile and an axe, and his hands needed something to do. On the fifth day, when Henry Foss's wagon wheel came loose from its axle in front of the boarding house, Patrick had it back on in 40 minutes while Henry stood to the side and provided unhelpful commentary, and Pearl brought both men coffee and observed the operation with the quiet interest of someone who finds competence genuinely pleasing to watch. She did not pretend not to find it pleasing. She was not built for pretense, but she was also careful. She had seen women in Austin give their hearts away to charming, capable men and receive in return a kind of comfortable neglect that was harder to identify than outright unkindness and harder still to escape. She had decided when she bought the boarding house that she would not arrange her life around wanting something from someone who was not in the habit of giving. She liked her life. She liked her house and her accounts and her routine. She liked the way the sun came through the kitchen window in the morning, and the way the whole town smelled after rain. She simply needed to stop noticing that Patrick Hawkins's eyes were doing that thing when he thought no one was looking. On the 7th evening, a storm came through, not a flood storm, a dry electric storm that lit up the sky above Harlow's Bend in great silent forks and made the air smell of copper and dust. Pearl was on the front porch watching it, as she always watched storms because there was something in the scale of them that she found clarifying, when she heard the screen door open and Patrick came out and leaned against the porch post beside her. "Could not sleep," he said. "Neither could I," she said. They watched the lightning in silence for a while. It was a comfortable silence, she noticed, in the way that a chair fits well before you've gotten used to it and you feel the good fit before you've quite named it. "How long did it take?" he said eventually. "How long did what take to make this place feel like yours?" She thought about it. "About 6 months before it felt like a house I lived in. About 18 months before it felt like mine." She paused. Now it would feel strange to be anywhere else. He was quiet for a moment. "I built mine in 2 summers. Thought once it was done it would feel like something permanent. Did it, for a while." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the lightning, and the light it threw across his face was intermittent and dramatic, which was not the context in which she had chosen to notice that he was a very handsome man, but here they were. "You will rebuild," she said, "when the water goes down." "I know," he said. It came out not quite the way she expected, not with confidence but with something closer to resolution, the tone of a man who has said a thing he knows to be true but has not yet worked out how he feels about it. "Is there something you are afraid of?" she asked, because she was not built for pretense, and because something in the way he was holding himself suggested there was. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Starting over," he said finally. "I have done it before. I know I can do it. He stopped. "It gets harder to believe in the thing you are building when you have already watched it go." "What did you lose before?" she asked. He looked at her then, and she held his gaze steadily because she was the sort of person who could. "My mother when I was 17. A small ranch near Laredo that I built when I was 22, and had to sell when the owner of the adjacent land decided my fence line was in the wrong place, and he had more money for lawyers than I did. And a partner. He said the last word carefully, in the way one handles something that has healed but not entirely. A man I went into business with at 25 who took 2 years of my labor and my savings and walked off with them to New Mexico. I never heard from him again. She absorbed this quietly. That is a very large amount to carry, she said. I don't carry it, he said. I just learned from it. What did you learn? That the only person I can rely on completely is myself. She looked at the lightning. It was a belief she understood because she had held a version of it herself. But she had also run a boarding house for 2 years, and she knew what happened when a person needed something and had no one to need it from. She had seen it in boarders who got sick in their rooms and lay there 3 days before admitting they needed the doctor. She had seen it in ranchers who let fences fail and herds dwindle before asking for help from neighbors who would have been glad to give it. That is a useful lesson, she said carefully, and also an expensive one to keep paying for. He looked at her. You nearly drowned in a barn loft, she said, because no one knew you needed help until the Reverend made an assumption and I had a boat. Something shifted in his face. It was not quite agreement. It was something more like the expression of a man who has heard something he has been arguing against for years said in a way that suddenly makes the argument feel less convincing. I did not nearly drown, he said. You might have, she said, if the water had risen another foot. A silence. Thank you, he said, for coming. You are welcome, she said. Thank you for not arguing with me about getting in the skiff. Something happened in his face then that was unmistakably a smile, brief and real, and entirely different from the cautious almost smiles she had catalogued over the past week. She felt it land somewhere in her chest like a coal dropped on dry kindling, and she looked back at the lightning with more urgency than the lightning strictly warranted. They stayed on the porch until the storm moved east. Then they said good night and went inside, and Pearl stood in her kitchen for a few minutes with her hands flat on the table and talked herself firmly and sensibly back toward equilibrium. It did not entirely work. The days that followed had a rhythm that Patrick had not expected to find comfortable, and found completely comfortable. He woke early, as he always had, and Pearl was always already in the kitchen when he came downstairs, and she always poured coffee without comment because she had noticed in the first 3 days that he preferred to be quiet in the mornings, and she respected it without making a ceremony of respecting it. He would take his coffee to the back porch, and she would continue whatever she was doing in the kitchen, and the silence between them was the easiest silence he could remember. He began to help with breakfast without being asked. Not because he felt he owed it, but because his hands needed occupation, and because there was something about being in the kitchen with Pearl Donnelly that he found impossible to categorize, and therefore found himself seeking repeatedly. She moved in a kitchen the way a good rider moves on a horse, with an economy of motion that suggested long practice and genuine ease, and she had a habit of humming very quietly while she worked. Not songs exactly, just melodic threads that rose and fell with no particular intent, and he found this both distracting and deeply pleasant. She taught him on the 9th morning how to make biscuits properly, because he had been making them wrong his entire adult life, and she had watched him do it wrong for 3 mornings before saying something. She was not unkind about it. She simply moved beside him at the work table and showed him the correct ratio of fat to flour, the precise amount of liquid, the way to handle the dough without overworking it, and he paid attention with the same focused quality he brought to everything mechanical, and his biscuits came out considerably better on the first attempt. You learn fast, she said, sounding genuinely pleased. I pay attention, he said. To most things, she agreed. And then she was back at the stove and he stood at the work table for a moment trying to decide what she meant by that, which meant she had already won whatever the exchange was. On the 11th day, the water was down enough for a rider to get through on the road to the river land, and Patrick rode Sutter out to look at the damage. He came back late in the afternoon and sat on the front porch steps with his hat in his hands and his forearms on his knees, and Pearl, who had watched him ride out from the kitchen window and was now watching him return from the kitchen window, gave him 20 minutes before she went outside with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him on the steps. He took the cup without speaking. "How bad?" she asked. "The house will need to be gutted and rebuilt from the frame up on 2 of the 4 walls. The barn is structurally sound, but the loft will need new boards. The corral fence is gone entirely." He drank. "I lost 4 more cattle in the second surge. I did not know about that until today." He was quiet. "I have 15 head left." She knew enough about cattle operations to understand what that meant. A herd of 15 was not a herd that could sustain a ranch. It was a beginning if you were starting or an ending if you were not. "What will you do?" she asked. "Rebuild," he said. "Same as before." "Same as before, but this time accepting help," she said. He looked at her. "Is that a condition?" "No," she said. "It is an observation. There are men in this town who would help you raise those walls in a day if you asked them." "Men don't do things for free," he said. "Men in small towns do things for neighbors," she said, "because someday they will need the same in return. That is not charity, that is community. There is a difference." He drank his coffee and looked at the street. A wagon went past. One of the Caldwell brothers waved from across the road. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something it had probably invented. "I have not been a very present neighbor," he said. "No," she agreed, "but you could start." He turned to look at her, and there was something in the look that was different from before, less guarded, as if a door had opened slightly that had been latched a long time. "Pearl," he said. "Patrick," she said. And then neither of them said anything for a moment, and the evening light came down the street at a long angle and turned the dusk gold, and she thought she could probably sit on these steps for a very long time without minding. "Would you like more coffee?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She went inside to get it, and she was smiling before she made it to the kitchen, which she noted with some resignation and did not try to stop. The town barn raising happened on a Saturday in the 3rd week of October, after the water had fully receded and the ground had dried enough for wagons to make it out to the river land without sinking. Patrick had not asked for the barn raising, to be accurate. What had happened was that Reverend Alcott had mentioned at Sunday service that Patrick Hawkins's barn loft needed significant repair, and that any able-bodied men who could spare a Saturday would be serving their community well. And somehow, whether it was the Reverend's considerable influence or the general communal goodwill that had been accumulating in Harlow's Bend, since the flood had hit multiple families hard, and people had bonded in the surviving of it, 14 men showed up on a Saturday morning with tools and intentions. Patrick stood in his barnyard and looked at them arriving, wagon by wagon, and his expression was a thing that Pearl, who had driven out in her own wagon with 3 pots of stew and a bushel of cornbread to feed the workers their midday meal, watched from a careful distance. It was not quite the expression of a man who was grateful in a comfortable way. It was the expression of a man who was grateful in a way that hurt slightly, the way a limb hurts when circulation is returning to it after too long without, uncomfortable and necessary, and a signal of something coming back to life. She set up the food table by the wagon and stayed out of the way of the work, which was loud and busy and productive. The men joked and shouted instructions at each other and argued about the best way to join a header beam, and generally accomplished in 7 hours what would have taken Patrick working alone the better part of 2 weeks. By mid-afternoon, the loft was structurally complete and the new boards were in, smelling of fresh lumber in the October air. Patrick moved through the day steadily, working as hard as any man there and directing what needed directing with quiet authority, and several times Pearl watched him stop and listen to suggestions from other men, and actually modify his approach based on what they said, which she suspected was not a thing he had done with any regularity in the past. When the day was done and the men had eaten and begun to drift back toward their wagons, Olin Purdy, The blacksmith clapped Patrick on the shoulder and said they would come back next week for the house walls. Just say the word. Patrick looked at him and said, with some visible effort, that he would appreciate that. Olin grinned and climbed into his wagon. Pearl was loading her empty pots when Patrick appeared beside her. "Let me," he said, and took the heaviest pot. "Thank you," she said. He loaded it into her wagon and turned to face her. He was covered in sawdust and the light sweat of a hard day's work, and his hat was pushed back on his head, and he looked, she thought, like a man who was slightly more at ease than usual. "You organized this," he said. It was not quite an accusation. "The Reverend organized it," she said. "The Reverend suggested it. Someone talked the Reverend into suggesting it." She arranged a pot very carefully in the wagon bed. "A community should look after its members," she said. "Pearl," she looked up. "Thank you," he said, and the way he said it was different from any time he had said it before. It had a weight to it, a depth, like a word being used for more than it technically contained. "You are welcome," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. They looked at each other in the October afternoon, and the sky behind the new barn loft was that particular shade of Texas blue that exists only in the fall, deep and clear and vast. And Pearl Donnelly thought that she was in very serious trouble and had been for some time. "I should get back," she said. "Evening supper." "Of course," he said. He helped her with the last of the loading. Their hands reached for the same pot at the same moment and touched briefly, and they both stepped back as if the pot had developed opinions about it. Pearl climbed up onto the wagon seat with perhaps more efficiency than the situation required, and clicked the mare forward and drove the quarter-mile to the road before allowing herself to breathe normally. October turned toward November, and Patrick rode into town each day to work on the house reconstruction while continuing to stay at the boarding house, because his house was not yet habitable, and because Pearl had not mentioned any urgency about his room, and because, if he were going to be honest with himself, he was in no particular hurry to leave, and he was not entirely sure what to do with that. He was not a man who talked about feelings. He was not a man who talked about much that did not serve an immediate practical purpose. But there was something about Pearl Donnelly that made him want to find words for things he had previously considered wordless. She was not like the women he had known briefly in his 20s, who were charming and pretty and mostly interested in what could be made of a man rather than who the man was. She was not soft in the way he'd once thought women needed to be, or strong in the way he'd sometimes thought they weren't. She was simply herself, completely and without apology, a woman who ran her house with quiet excellence and cared about the people around her without making a performance of caring, and who looked at him sometimes in a way that made him feel seen in a manner that was neither comfortable nor something he could bring himself to want to stop. He began to find reasons to be in the kitchen in the evenings. He would claim he needed a second cup of coffee. He would say he had noticed the back door hinge was loose, and he had the tools right there. Once, memorably, he stood in the kitchen doorway for a full minute trying to think of a reason to come in before Pearl looked up from her mending and said, "Are you going to stand there, or are you going to come in and sit down?" And he had come in and sat down, and they had talked for 2 hours about things he could not fully recount afterward, but which had included her father's schoolroom in Austin and his mother's garden in Laredo and books they had both read and opinions about the territory's chances of statehood and the best method for preserving dried beef. And at some point the lamp had burned low, and they had both noticed it at once, and the evening had ended with a good night said quietly and carefully from opposite sides of the kitchen table. He lay awake that night for a long time. It was Loretta Vance who finally said what was evident to everyone in the boarding house. She said it on a Wednesday morning in November when Patrick was out at the river property, and Pearl was in the front room going over her account books, and Loretta brought in her sewing basket and sat in the opposite chair, and said, without preamble, that Pearl was going to have to do something about the situation, because the man was clearly hopeless in the specific way of a capable man who does not know how to move toward something he wants for fear of making a mistake he cannot fix. Pearl looked up from her accounts. "What situation?" she said. Loretta gave her a look that expressed a very complete opinion of this question. Pearl put down her pencil. "He has not said anything," she said. "He looks at you like you personally hung the moon," Loretta said, threading a needle with the efficient precision of long practice. "And you look at him like you are reading a book you cannot put down and are also afraid of what the last chapter says. Both of those things are very visible to everyone in this house, Pearl. Amos and Roy have not said anything." "Amos and Roy would not say something if you set the table on fire," Loretta said. "Henry Foss has mentioned it twice." Pearl was quiet for a moment. "He is my boarder," she said. "He is a man you pulled out of a flood who has been in your kitchen every night for 3 weeks talking to you until the lamp burns out," Loretta said. "That is not a boarder relationship, Pearl. That is something else." Pearl looked at her accounts. The numbers were steady and clear and completely uninteresting to her in this moment. "He has had a very hard time of it," she said. "He is still rebuilding. It would be unfair to what?" Loretta asked. "To let him know that someone thinks well of him. I have known men who needed nothing so much as that, and I have known them to wait a very long time for it because everyone assumed they did not need it." She bit her thread. "He is not fragile, he is closed. There is a difference, and I believe you know it." Pearl sat with this for a while. "I would not know how to begin," she said finally, and it came out more honestly than she had intended. Loretta smiled, not unkindly. "I think you already have begun," she said. "Multiple times, with biscuit lessons and front porch coffee and sitting on the steps after he came back from seeing the flood damage." She folded her sewing. "The beginning has already happened. You are now in the middle, and you are the only one who can decide whether there is an after." That afternoon Pearl rode out to the river property. It was a cold November afternoon, the sky the color of pewter and the mesquite leaves dry and thin, and the road to the property had fully firmed up and was good for riding. She arrived to find Patrick on the side of the house with a level and a straight edge, checking the alignment of the new wall studs, and Sutter tied to a fence post looking entirely comfortable. Patrick turned when he heard the mare and his expression went through several things in quick succession, surprise and something that looked very much like pleasure, and then the careful smoothing over that he applied when his face had given away more than he intended. "Pearl," he said, "everything all right?" "Everything is fine," she said, dismounting. She tied the mare beside Sutter and walked to him. She looked at the new wall, which was straight and solid and smelled of fresh-cut lumber. "You are making good progress," she said. "Another week," he said. "Maybe 2 for the finishing inside." She nodded. She looked at the property in its November light, the new barn loft, the rebuilt corral fence, the house coming back together with its new bones. The flood line was still visible on what remained of the original structure, a dark horizontal mark about 3 feet up the old wood, a watermark as literal as a signature. "What will you do differently," she said, "when you move back in?" He looked at her sideways. "Differently how?" She thought about how to say it. "You said you have built things and lost them, the farm near Laredo, the partnership, this house in the flood." She paused. "What will be different this time?" He leaned against the new wall and looked at the sky. "I have been thinking about that," he said, "and I am going to ask for things when I need them," he said. "Not because I can't manage alone, but because I have been managing alone for 20 years and the managing has cost me more than it has saved me." He was quiet for a moment. "I think I have been confusing self-reliance with refusing help, and those are not the same thing. Self-reliance is knowing what you need and finding a way to get it. What I have been doing is deciding in advance that I should not need anything, and then paying the cost of that decision without calling it a cost." She looked at him. "You said something to me," he said, "the night on the porch, about the skiff and what might have happened if the water had risen further. I have been thinking about that." "I have thought about it too," she said. "Pearl," he said, and turned to face her fully. "I am not good at this." "At what?" she asked, though she knew. "At saying things that matter," he said. "I have been in your kitchen every night for 3 weeks because I do not want to be anywhere else. I have been fixing every loose board and chopping every cord of wood because I could not think of another way to—" He stopped. I have been doing things when I should have been saying things." She waited. "I would like to keep seeing you," he said, "after I move back to the house, in a proper way if you are willing, because I think you are the most remarkable person I have met in a very long time, and I am aware that I have not done a very good job of saying so, and I wanted to be clear about it before I moved back, and the opportunity to say it easily was gone." She studied him for a moment. He held her gaze with the steadiness that was characteristic of him, that deep, honest stillness, and she saw clearly that this had cost him something and that he was prepared to pay it. "I think that would be very agreeable," she said. He blinked. "Yes." "Yes, Patrick," she said, and she smiled at him. A full and unguarded smile, which she knew from Loretta's comments was a thing she had been conserving for some time. He looked at her smile for a moment with an expression that she would describe to Loretta that evening as a man who has been given something he expected to have to work considerably harder for, and is not sure whether to be relieved or suspicious, and he settled eventually into something that was neither of those things, but was close to the warmest expression she had seen on his face. "All right," he said. He almost reached for her hand, and then seemed to decide that was a step taken in proper order, and she appreciated the consideration. "All right," she agreed. He moved back to the river property in the last week of November, when the interior walls were finished and the floors had been swept clean of sawdust, and the kitchen stove had been tested and found to draw correctly. He moved back with his tin box and his Bible and his rifle and the pocket watch that had survived the flood in his coat pocket, and he stood in his rebuilt kitchen for a while, and let it settle over him that it was still his and still here, and that this time he had not built it entirely alone. He came to supper at the boarding house that Friday evening, because Pearl had asked him, and because he had said yes before she finished the sentence, which was not his typical response pattern but which felt accurate. He sat at the table with the boarders and ate Pearl's cooking and talked more than he typically talked, and Loretta Vance caught his eye across the table once and gave him a look that was approximately 70% approval and 30% warning, and he received both portions in the spirit intended. After supper, he helped Pearl clear the table, which was not a thing boarders generally did, and she let him because she was not going to argue with help freely offered. They worked in the kitchen in a comfortable close proximity, and the lamp was lit and the November wind was at the windows, and when the dishes were washed and dried, Pearl turned from the shelf where she was putting them away and found Patrick standing close enough that the difference in their heights was suddenly very apparent. "Thank you for supper," he said. "Thank you for coming," she said. A pause. "I should go," he said. "It is a cold night and Sutter does not like the dark." "Sutter is a horse," she said. "He will manage." "Pearl," he said. "Patrick," she said. And then he did something he had clearly been deciding about for several weeks, which was to step forward and take her hand, her right hand, in both of his, and hold it carefully in the way that a man holds something he intends to be responsible for, and look at her. "I would very much like to call on you properly," he said, "if that is agreeable to you." "You already asked me that at the property," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to say it again somewhere with a lamp and a proper floor under us." She laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and he looked at it with the expression of a man who has discovered something precious and is already thinking about how to keep it safe. "Yes," she said. "Come on Sunday." He did come on Sunday, and the Sundays after that, and he came on some of the Thursdays in between, and Pearl's front parlor became the regular setting for the most earnest and attentive courtship that Loretta Vance, who had an apartment of opinions on the matter of courtship, had witnessed in her 40 years. Henry Foss said it was like watching a very careful man try to carry a very full cup of water without spilling a drop, which was meant as a compliment and received as such. Patrick brought Pearl things. He was not a man who brought flowers, which she suspected he found too obvious, but he brought her things that suggested he had been paying attention. A book he had sourced from the general store in town, a volume of natural history she had mentioned once in passing that she had been interested in reading, A jar of good honey from a man out near the ridge who kept bees. Once on a cold December Thursday, a pair of good leather gloves because he had noticed hers were wearing through, and he had ridden to San Antonio for supplies and seen them in a shop window. She kept the gloves in the kitchen and wore them every cold morning, and whenever anyone asked she said they were a gift and did not elaborate, which was a kind of deliberate privacy that she thought Patrick would appreciate. She began to understand him in layers. The first layer was the capable enclosed exterior that everyone in Harlow's Bend saw, the rancher who handled his own business and kept to himself. The second layer was the man she had come to know at her table, thoughtful and quietly observant, with a dry wit that surfaced at unexpected moments, and a genuine interest in what other people thought that he had disguised as indifference for so long it had become habit. Below that was the third layer, which she encountered in the longer conversations, the ones that went late into the evening beside the parlor fire on Sunday nights when the other boarders had gone to bed, in which he talked about his mother and the Laredo years, and the partner who had betrayed him with an honesty that she understood was not natural to him, and was something he was choosing to offer because he had decided she was the person he could choose to offer it to. She told him things in return. She told him about her mother dying when she was 13 and what that had done to the shape of things in her family, the way her father had loved her but had been so overwhelmed by his own grief that she had learned very early to fill the space herself, to need less, to need herself mostly. She told him about Austin and the dry goods store and the 4 years she had saved every dollar, and why she had decided that owning her own place was more important to her than any other arrangement she had been offered, and she had been offered some other arrangements by men who were confident they were the better idea. Were any of them, he asked, were any of them the better idea? She considered. 2 of them were perfectly decent men, but neither of them saw me very clearly. They saw what they wanted to make of me, which was a version of myself that would have fit their lives better than it would have fit my own. He was quiet for a moment. "I think I see you fairly clearly," he said. "I think you do," she agreed. "It is one of the things I like about you." "What are the other things?" he asked, and there was something in the way he asked it, a slight careful quality that told her the question mattered more to him than he was making it appear. She looked at him. "You are honest," she said, "even when the honest thing is hard to say. You are more generous than you know, because you do not think of it as generosity. You think of it as simply what is right. You are patient with people in a way that is not passive but is very intentional, and you make very good biscuits now." She held his gaze. "Also, you rode into a flood at night to move your cattle to higher ground because you would not let them come to harm if there was anything left in you to prevent it. That told me a great deal about the kind of man you are." He did not say anything for a long moment. "Pearl," he said, "yes, I am going to say something and I would like you to let me finish it before you respond." "All right," she said. He turned toward her fully and set his coffee cup down and looked at her with that direct, steady look that she had first seen from a barn loft door in a flood, and that had somehow, over the months since, become the look she thought of when she thought of him, which was frequently. "I have been alone by choice for a very long time," he said, "and I chose it because I believed it was the safest arrangement for a man who had been through what I had been through. I thought relying on anyone was the same as giving them the means to damage you. I thought the only honest position was to want nothing from anyone and to make sure you needed nothing they could take." He paused. "I was wrong," he said, "not because it is a terrible philosophy in theory, but because it makes a terrible life in practice. And I did not know how terrible it was until I was sitting in a flooded barn in the dark watching everything I had built float away. And then I heard you rowing through my corral in a flat-bottomed skiff, and you said you had brought food, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time." "What did you feel?" she asked quietly. "Safe," he said. "Completely and immediately and without having had to earn it. You did not make me earn it, you just came." She was quiet. "I love you," he said. I know that is a great deal to say, and I know it is December, and we have been calling on each other for only 2 months, but I have been working towards saying it honestly for considerably longer than 2 months, and I would rather say it early and true than late and careful." She looked at him in the firelight. The parlor was warm and the wind was outside, and his eyes were that deep brown that she had decided some time ago she could read very well, and what she read in them now was entirely honest and also very slightly terrified. "Patrick," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you too," she said. "I have for quite a while. I was somewhat annoyed about it at first." A beat of silence, and then he laughed, a full and genuine laugh. And she had heard him laugh before, but not quite like that, not the full volume, unreserved version, and it was wonderful. He reached across and took her hand, and this time neither of them stepped back. He proposed on a Thursday evening in January, standing in her kitchen, which she would later tell people, and which he would confirm was completely correct, and which she would say she found entirely fitting, because more things of significance had happened between them in that kitchen than anywhere else. He did it without elaborate staging, which was consistent with everything she had come to know of him. He simply said that he would like to marry her, if she would have him, and that he understood her life was here and her house was hers, and he was not asking her to give any of that up, but to let him be part of it, and that he intended to be a man worth being part of her life for as long as she would allow it. She said yes before he finished the sentence, which was becoming characteristic of them in the matter of important questions. They were married in March of 1883, on a clear cold morning with the mesquite just beginning to bud, in the little church on Clement Street, where Reverend Alcott had been presiding for 22 years, and who performed the ceremony with considerable satisfaction, as he had been to some degree the architect of the whole situation, by sending Pearl out in the flood with her skiff, and had been privately pleased about it ever since. Pearl wore a dress she had made herself, ivory wool with simple trim, and she wore her hair down with a blue ribbon, and when Patrick turned to watch her walk up the aisle his expression was the kind that Loretta Vance, who cried from the second pew, described afterward as the face of a man who has realized that a thing he had given up expecting has just become the most real thing in his life. Olin Purdy stood as Patrick's witness. Pearl's closest friend in town, the postmistress Mary Alcott, who was the Reverend's wife and a warm and sensible woman of 45, stood as Pearl's. The Caldwell brothers sat in the back and looked pleased. Henry Foss wore his good coat. They spoke their vows clearly, both of them, in voices that carried across the small church without wavering, because they were both the sort of people who, once they had decided a thing, were decided about it entirely. Afterward there was a celebration at the boarding house, because Pearl had organized it herself with the help of Mary Alcott and Loretta, and there was food and music from the fiddle player Jim Ruiz, who played at the saloon on Friday nights, but was perfectly happy to play a wedding on a Saturday morning for a fair rate and the promise of a good meal. And Patrick danced with Pearl in the boarding house parlor with the furniture pushed back. And he danced carefully but earnestly, and she did not care one bit about the careful, because the earnestness was everything. They lived in a particular arrangement for the first year of their marriage that suited both of them. They kept the boarding house because it was Pearl's, and because it brought reliable income, and because Pearl had built something of herself into it, and Patrick would never have asked her to set that aside. He rebuilt his river property and maintained it, and she helped him hire a good hand, a young Mexican cowboy named Cristobal Ibarra, who was 20 years old and excellent with cattle, and who had been drifting through Harlow's Bend, looking for steady work after being let go unfairly from a ranch north of the territory, where the owner had decided he would rather employ white hands, which was the kind of injustice that still happened daily, and that Pearl had specific opinions about, and Patrick agreed with entirely. They hired Cristobal and paid him a fair wage, and he was excellent at his work and grateful for the respect of being hired and treated well, which he did not take for granted, and which Pearl and Patrick noticed and thought about. It was Cristobal who first began to show them that the cattle operation could grow if they were strategic about it. He knew the land south of the Rio Bravo in ways that Patrick had only begun to understand, and he had a feel for where the grass would be good and which routes would keep the herd in better condition. Patrick listened to him with the attention he now brought to anyone who knew something he did not, which was the same quality of listening he had brought to Pearl's biscuit instruction in the kitchen a year before, and the cattle operation began to grow. By the end of their first year together, they had 40 head. By the end of the second year, 63. Cristobal, who was proving himself indispensable, was given a raise, and a small cabin built at the edge of the property, which he accepted with the same quiet dignity with which he did everything. And in the spring of 1884, Pearl told Patrick over the kitchen table at the boarding house that they were going to have a baby. He sat very still for a moment, and then stood up and came around the table and took her face in both hands and pressed his forehead to hers. And neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing that needed saying. Their son was born in November of 1884. On a cold and windy night with Mary Alcott as the midwife and Patrick in the adjoining room doing what men of the era did while their wives gave birth, which was pace and pray and try not to show either activity too obviously. Pearl delivered with the same determined practical focus she brought to all difficult things, and when Mary Alcott put the baby in her arms, Pearl looked at the red and indignant face of her son, and felt something shift in her chest so profoundly, she was not sure she would be exactly the same arrangement of herself afterward. She would not be. That was what children did. Patrick was brought in and sat beside her and held the baby for the first time with the careful deliberateness of a man holding something very precious and very fragile, and his expression was the one she had never seen before, which was to say it was an expression without any of the careful management that usually lived in his face, just open and overwhelmed and entirely, completely present. "What do we call him?" he asked. "I thought Thomas," she said, "for your mother." His mother's name had been Thomasina. She had told him this was her thinking weeks ago, and he had gone very quiet in the way that meant something had reached him deeply. "Thomas," he said, and looked at the baby. Thomas Hawkins had dark hair from his first day, which everyone said was common and would fall out, and which did not fall out and grew into the same dark thick hair as his father, and he had Pearl's eyes, which were gray-green and clear and looked at the world with a steadiness that both his parents found deeply familiar. He grew into a determined, observant child who liked to follow Patrick around the property asking questions about everything, and who asked those questions with a precision that made Patrick think of Pearl and smile. By the time Thomas was 3, he could name every tool in the barn and knew all 15 of the ranch hands' horses by name and gait. By the time he was 4, he was helping Cristobal with small tasks, and Cristobal took to him with the patient affection of a young man who had found, in this place, a sense of family he had not expected. Pearl and Patrick built a house on the river property in the spring of 1886, a larger house than the one the flood had taken, with 4 proper bedrooms and a kitchen twice the size and a front porch that ran the full length of the house and faced the river so that in the evenings you could sit and watch the light change on the water. Pearl had designed the kitchen herself and Patrick had built it to her specification, and it was, in the opinion of everyone who cooked in it or ate from it, an excellent kitchen. The boarding house on Clement Street they did not sell. They hired a couple to manage it, the Hartleys, who were quiet and reliable, and Pearl remained involved in its accounts and came to town once a week to review everything and visit with Loretta Vance and Mary Alcott, and generally remain connected to the town life that had been hers for years before she knew Patrick's name. It was a good arrangement. Pearl's life remained hers. Patrick's land was theirs. The work was shared and the credit was shared, and the evenings were spent on the big front porch watching the river, and talking about the things they had each been thinking about during the day, which was a habit they had carried from the boarding house kitchen table, and which they intended to carry as long as they had days to fill. In the summer of 1887, Pearl told Patrick over supper on the porch that there was going to be a second child. Thomas, who was 2.5 and could follow more conversation than anyone gave him credit for, looked up from his corn and said with absolute confidence that it was going to be a girl, and then returned to his corn, and Pearl and Patrick looked at each other and laughed. Thomas was correct. Their daughter was born in February of 1888, on a night that was cold enough for frost but not cold enough for real winter, which felt like something to Pearl when she thought about it later. They named her Clara, after Pearl's mother, and Clara arrived into the world with an entirely different energy than Thomas had, not the solemn looking and thinking quality of her brother, but a bright and immediate aliveness that made the room feel warmer the moment she was in it. Patrick held her the same way he had held Thomas, with that careful, overwhelmed openness, and said softly that Clara was a good name, and Pearl said she thought so too, and Thomas stood at the bedside on his tiptoes to see his sister and said, with the satisfied authority of a child who has been proven right, "I said so." The life they built across those years was not without its hard passages. There were drought years and hard winters, and a sickness in the cattle that Cristobal and Patrick fought through a full spring to manage. There was a conflict with a neighbor to the east who disputed the fence line on the eastern edge of Patrick's property, an unpleasant man named Calloway Jr. Coincidentally, the son of the same Calloway who had left his skiff at Pearl's boarding house, who was not half the person his father was, and who believed that aggression was the same thing as negotiation. Patrick handled it with patience and a lawyer and ultimately a correct survey that settled the matter without violence, which was the outcome Pearl had told him from the beginning he could achieve if he was patient, and which he had needed to hear twice before he believed it. There was also the matter of Cristobal Ibarra, who by 1889 had been with them 6 years, and who had, during that time, fallen quietly and completely in love with a young woman named Rosaria who worked at the mercantile in town. He had not said anything about this for an extended period because he was not sure of his footing in the matter of personal things, which Patrick recognized as an affliction he had personal expertise with. It was Pearl who noticed first and who sat Cristobal down one afternoon and asked him directly, kindly, and without making it awkward, what he intended to do about Rosaria, and Cristobal had told her with considerable relief that he intended to marry her if she would have him, and he was only uncertain whether his circumstances were sufficient. Pearl told him his circumstances were fine, and that sufficiency was a modest standard for a man of his quality. Then she gave him the afternoon off to go to town and ask Rosaria, which he did, and Rosaria said yes, and the wedding was in the fall, and it was a good wedding, and Thomas Hawkins was the boy who carried the ring. Cristobal and Rosaria built their life on the edge of the property, and Rosaria's presence changed the character of the place in ways that were entirely welcome. She was warm and funny, and had an opinion on everything and no reluctance to express it, and she and Pearl became close in the way of women who recognize in each other a certain quality of self-possession and find it restful. Patrick and Pearl marked their 5th wedding anniversary in March of 1888 by riding out, just the two of them, to the spot on the property where the old barn had stood in the flood, now rebuilt and solid and smelling of hay and horses in good use. They tied the horses and walked to the place where the water line had once reached, and the land around them was green from early spring rain, not the catastrophic flood rain of 5 years before, but the steady, ordinary, hopeful kind. "I keep thinking about it," he said. "The flood," she said. "The barn door," he said. "I opened it and looked down, and there you were in a coat 3 sizes too large for you, rowing through my corral at 8 in the morning with a basket of food, as if it were the most ordinary thing." "It was not so extraordinary," she said. "Someone needed help. I had a boat." He looked at her. 5 years of marriage had not changed the quality of the way he looked at her, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him and to love without qualification. He did not become accustomed to things he valued. He remained aware of them. "I had never asked anyone for help," he said. "I would have found a way eventually. I told myself that. But the truth is I would have stayed in that loft until the water came down, and then I would have walked back into that empty house and tried to rebuild it completely alone, and it would have taken me 3 years, and I would have done it, and it would not have been enough, even when it was done." "But that is not what happened," she said. "That is not what happened," he agreed. She took his hand because she had been taking his hand for 5 years, and it still felt as deliberate and chosen as the first time. "You asked for help after that," she said, "in 100 different ways." "I learned too," he said. "You taught me that." "You taught yourself," she said. "I just rowed the boat." He smiled, and it was the full, warm smile, the one that she had first seen in her kitchen when he had realized she was genuinely amused, and that had not become less dear in 5 years of seeing it regularly. "You did considerably more than row the boat," he said. "I know," she said, "but so did you." They stood at the edge of the old flood line in the early spring sun, his hand in hers, and the river behind them was calm and silver, and minding its own business, which was all she had ever asked of it, and the property around them was alive with the sounds of work and growth and daily life. Cristobal's voice somewhere near the south fence, the sound of Thomas somewhere near the barn doing something that probably involved getting into something he shouldn't. The distant domestic sound of Rosaria's singing carrying across the yard. "Are you happy?" He asked her, not because he was uncertain, but because he was a man who had learned that the things that mattered most deserved to be checked on regularly. "Completely," she said, without hesitation, because it was true and because he deserved the true answer plainly given. "Good," he said, and squeezed her hand, and she leaned against his shoulder for a moment in the spring sun, just one moment of the thousands they had accumulated and the thousands still ahead of them, and felt the particular ease of a life that had been chosen thoughtfully and built carefully and was, in all the ways that mattered, entirely hers. When Thomas was 7 and Clara was 4, Pearl and Patrick made the decision that would shape the next decade of their life together, which was to expand the cattle operation to a scale that required a genuine second structure on the property. They built a second barn, larger than the first, and hired 2 additional ranch hands on Cristobal's recommendation, young men named Gabriel Reyes and Beau Sutter, the latter of whom shared his name accidentally with Patrick's horse, and who handled the coincidence with the kind of good nature that suggested he was going to do well in the work. The ranch was beginning to be something real, not just a surviving thing but a growing thing. Cristobal had proved himself over 7 years to be a man of extraordinary skill and genuine loyalty, and Patrick had long since stopped thinking of him as an employee in any simple sense, and had made him a formal partner in the operation, which Cristobal had accepted with quiet dignity, and which Rosaria had celebrated by cooking a dinner large enough for 12 people, and inviting everyone on the property to eat it. Pearl's boarding house continued to run reliably under the Hartleys' management, and she went to town weekly to review the books and spend time with her friends in Harlow's Bend, and maintain the connections she had built before she married Patrick, and which she continued to value as a part of herself that had nothing to do with the ranch and everything to do with who she was. She also took on, in a quiet way, the matter of the local school. Harlow's Bend had a schoolhouse and a school teacher, a competent but overworked man named Mr. Pierce, and Pearl had noticed that the school had no library, only a set of primers worn thin with use and a Bible, and that a number of the children coming through the school, particularly those from the Mexican families south of town, were not being adequately served because the instruction was only in English, and Mr. Pierce was a man of good will but limited imagination about the problem. Pearl organized a book drive through Clement Street and several of the neighboring towns, and acquired enough donated volumes to fill 2 solid shelves. She also arranged for Rosaria, who was bilingual and had several years of schooling in both languages, to come to the schoolhouse on Tuesday and Thursday mornings to help with the younger students, an arrangement that Mr. Pierce agreed to with relief and Rosaria undertook with tremendous enthusiasm. It was a small thing in the scheme of the territory's problems, but it was a thing that could be done, and Pearl Donnelly Hawkins had a very long history of doing the thing that could be done. Patrick knew about all of it and had opinions about none of it except positive ones, which Pearl had come to realize was one of the things she most valued about him. He did not involve himself in her projects in a managing way. He listened when she talked about them, asked questions when he had them, offered practical support when it was useful, and otherwise understood that her work was hers in the same way the ranch was his, something they shared in the partnership of a life together while remaining fully themselves inside it. "You are a remarkable woman," he told her one evening on the porch, watching the river. "You have said that before," she said. "It remains accurate," he said. "You are a remarkable man," she said, "for someone who did not know how to ask for help." "I know how now," he said. "I know," she said. "I have noticed." He reached over and took her hand, which he did most evenings when they sat on this porch, a habit so deep and comfortable now that it required no thought, just the extension of a hand and the ease of a grip returned. Thomas came running from around the side of the house with the specific urgency of a 7-year-old who has discovered something important and needs to report it immediately. And the something turned out to be a very large beetle, which he presented to his father for identification. Patrick examined it with appropriate seriousness and identified it correctly as a horned beetle, and Thomas accepted this information, looked at the beetle, looked at his father and said, "Can I keep it?" Pearl said no, and Thomas said why, and Pearl gave the explanation about beetles belonging in the ground, and Thomas accepted this with the philosophical resignation of a child who had long since understood that his mother's no's were firm, and his father's firm no's were equally firm, and neither would be moved by further argument. The beetle was released with some ceremony at the edge of the porch. Clara, who was 4 and had been watching this whole operation from the doorway with the air of a person who considers herself above beetles, came out and climbed into Pearl's lap, and settled there with the absolute confidence of a child who knows exactly where she belongs. Patrick looked at his family on the porch in the evening light, the same light that had changed his life one September flood ago, and felt the fullness of it press against whatever it was inside him that had been afraid of fullness for so long. He was not afraid of it anymore. In the spring of 1893, Patrick and Pearl Hawkins celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary with the kind of celebration that a family does privately, which is to say they celebrated it on the front porch of the house they had built together, with their children and their friends, and the particular piece of people who have done the work that love requires and found the work worth doing. Thomas was 9 and Clara was 6, and the ranch ran 60 head of cattle, and Cristobal and Rosaria had 2 children of their own, a boy of 4 named Emilio and a daughter of 2 named Lucia, and the property was busy and alive, and the kind of place that good work makes. Loretta Vance came out for the anniversary dinner because Pearl had invited her, and because Loretta never missed anything she was invited to, and Henry Foss sent a letter from San Antonio where he had retired, and Reverend Alcott and Mary Alcott came and sat on the porch and drank lemonade and were enormously pleased with themselves for the part they had played in the whole story. "I simply said someone ought to check on the Hawkins place," the Reverend said. "And you chose Pearl specifically," Mary said. "I may have thought she had a boat," he said. "You may have thought considerably more than that," Mary said, and he smiled into his lemonade and said nothing. Pearl and Patrick sat on the porch after the guests had gone and the children were in bed, and the evening was deep and the river was visible from where they sat as a moving silver line in the dark. "10 years," she said. 10 years, he said. "What would you tell yourself?" she asked. "The man in the barn loft." He thought about it. "Get in the boat," he said. She laughed. "What would you tell yourself?" he asked. "The woman in the skiff." She considered. That he is going to be more than worth the rowing, she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him beside her in the dark the way you can feel a fire when you are close to it, not from heat exactly but from a kind of presence that changes the quality of the air. "Pearl," he said. "Yes, Patrick," she said. "I love you," he said, "in case I have not said it with sufficient clarity and regularity." "You say it every day," she said. "Good," he said. "Every day seems like the appropriate frequency." She leaned over and put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat that way in the September dark on the porch of the house they had built beside the river that had once taken everything. And the river flowed past in the dark, minding its business, carrying nothing but water, and the whole of their life was around them and in the house behind them and in the future ahead of them, warm and solid and entirely, irrevocably, peacefully theirs. In the years that followed, the ranch continued to grow, and so did the family's roots in Harlow's Bend. Thomas grew into a serious and capable boy, and then into a serious and capable young man who had his father's steadiness and his mother's way with people, and who by the time he was 15 was riding beside Christabel and handling himself well enough in the work that Patrick began to think about what the place would look like when Thomas ran it. Not soon, not for a long time, but the thinking was there, and it was a good kind of thinking, forward-looking and hopeful. Clara grew in the direction opposite from what her early composure had suggested. She became the most talkative person in the family, which was a distinction that required no effort in competition with her father and only moderate effort in competition with her mother. And she had opinions about everything and the vocabulary to express them fully. And Pearl watched her daughter develop, and felt a particular quiet pride that she recognized as seeing something of herself reflected and improved upon simultaneously. The school on the edge of Harlow's Bend had grown with Pearl's involvement into a genuinely better institution, with a proper library and instruction that served all the children in the area, not only the ones whose names matched the territory's dominant language. It was a small change in a large and unjust landscape, but it was change in the right direction, and Pearl believed that you did the thing in front of you and trusted that small rights accumulated into something larger over time. Christabel and Rosaria celebrated their own 10th anniversary in 1899, and by then they had 3 children, and Christabel was as much a part of the Hawkins ranch as Patrick himself, and the 2 men had built, over those years, the kind of friendship that develops between people who have worked closely in hard conditions and respected each other throughout. It was not a friendship of long conversations and confidences, though both of those things happened sometimes. It was primarily a friendship built in the daily fact of shared work and mutual trust, and it was among the steadiest things in Patrick's life. Pearl and Rosaria had the other kind of friendship, the long conversation kind, and they spent many hours together over the years in the kitchen of the ranch house or the kitchen of Christabel's cabin, talking about everything from cattle prices to their children's futures, to the general insufficiency of the territory's laws regarding women's property and the slow, grinding progress of changing them. Patrick listened to those conversations when they spilled into the evenings and did not tell Pearl she was wrong about any of it, which she credited to good sense on his part. He had, in the years since the flood, developed a capacity for understanding that the world beyond his property had conditions that affected the people on it, and that caring about those conditions was not separate from being a good man but was part of it. It was a good life. Not easy, because no life that is worth anything is easy, but good in the substantial, real sense, the kind of goodness that has been tested and found to hold. On the morning of their 15th wedding anniversary, Patrick was in the kitchen before Pearl, which was unusual enough that she paused in the doorway when she came downstairs. He was making biscuits with the correct ratio and the correct handling, just as she had taught him in this same kitchen 13 years before, and there was coffee already made and the table was set for 2. "Sit down," he said, without turning around because he had heard her on the stairs. She sat down. He brought the biscuits to the table when they were done, golden and properly risen, and the coffee, and sat across from her, and they ate breakfast together in the kitchen of their house, with the morning light coming through the window just as it always did, falling at the same angle it had fallen on every one of the thousands of mornings they had spent in this house together. 15 years, she said. 15 years, he said. Do you know what I think about sometimes, she said. What? The fact that if it had not rained, she said, and if the river had not flooded, and if Reverend Alcott had not stood in my doorway and said someone ought to check on the Hawkins place, and if I had not had a boat, this would all be nothing. We would be nothing. You would be out there on the river land alone, and I would be in town in the boarding house, and we would nod at each other at Teague's General Store once a week and think nothing of it. He considered this. That is a very large amount of ifs, he said. Yes, she said, and they all happened, every single one. He looked at her across the breakfast table in the morning light, 15 years married, his wife and his best friend and the person who had rowed a boat through his corral at 8 in the morning in a flood and handed him food, and in doing so had handed him something considerably larger. I think, he said carefully, that even without the flood something would have been found. I think we would have sat next to each other at some church supper, and discovered we could not find a good reason to stop talking, or I would have come into the boarding house for some reason and never left. I think, he said, that some things are going to happen regardless of the particular path they take to get there. She smiled. That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me. I have become better at saying things, he said. You have, she agreed. He reached across the table and took her hand, their hands crossing the expanse of the kitchen table where they had had 100 conversations and eaten 1,000 meals and been, in the quiet daily way that sustained people across the span of a life, everything to each other that they had needed. Pearl, he said. Patrick, she said. Are you happy? He asked. The same question he had asked 15 years before in this same kitchen, and 10 years before on the front porch, and many times in between, because he was a man who had learned that the things that mattered deserved to be checked on, who understood that asking was not weakness but care. Completely, she said, as she always said, because it was always true, because she had built a life that was hers, and shared it with a man who was worth the sharing, and who understood the difference between belonging to someone and belonging with someone. Outside the kitchen window, the September morning was clear and bright, and the river was visible from where she sat, silver and ordinary and well-behaved, and the property was waking up with the sounds of work beginning, Christabel and Gabriel at the far barn, Thomas already out on his horse before breakfast as he had been for years, Clara's voice somewhere upstairs in an energetic argument with herself or the cat, or the general injustice of waking up on a school day. Patrick poured more coffee. The biscuits were good, the morning was full, the flood had taken everything once. And out of that everything, they had built something the flood could not touch, not because it was protected from loss, all things are subject to loss, but because it was built on a foundation that held when the water came, which was the plain and extraordinary fact of two people who had chosen each other and kept choosing, every morning over coffee, and every evening on the porch, and every moment in between that makes up a life. He had never asked anyone for help until the flood took everything. And she had already been there, and that had been, without question, more than enough.